The Kingdome imploded, and Seattleites could not look away. At 25 stories tall and 2 blocks wide, it was one of the biggest status symbols on the planet. For a quarter century since it opened on March 27, 1976, its 260 million pounds anchored the city in the big leagues. Mediocre for most of their history, the Seahawks compiled a respectable 177 record at the Kingdome. In their 1979 championship season, the Sonics led the league in home attendance there. Come holy triumph or damn defeat, Seattle fanatics crammed into this citadel of civic connection. 414,000 strong attended the Good Reverend Billy Graham's 8-day evangelist extravaganza in May 1976 there. That set the record for largest home crowd ever for a single event, and in the history books, the Kingdome had a place that could never be erased. But a single day shy of its 24th birthday on Sunday, March 26, 2000, it would be reduced to rubble. Controlled Demolition Inc. strapped 4,461 pounds of explosives to its roofs. The Kingdome would implode at 8:30 a.m. After a course of detonation devices, the concrete colossus took 16.8 seconds to crumble. Yellowish-brown soot billowed from the blast site in Pioneer Square, sullying a sunny Seattle morning. The pall reached as high as the Bank of America Tower's 76 stories. It left dust everywhere it drifted. It was Mount St. Helens all over again. And after the show, Emerald City yokels marauded around Pioneer Square, cupping their hands to slide stadium detritus off of car windshields and into Ziploc bags because the rubbish could fetch a few bucks on the new website, eBay. On the city's hilltop neighborhoods, some of Seattle's nouveau riche held swanky implosion watch parties on the observation decks of high-rise condos. Some tech BPs and top-tier project managers congregated on rooftop bars, drinking mimosas and expensive microbrews while waiting for the final countdown. They rented the Smith Tower's 35th floor panorama and charged $216 a pop for champagne brunch views of the stadium's demise. Like their settler forebears who docked near the place that became Seattle in November 1851, they sailed their boats to Elliott Bay and set their sights on Pioneer Square. Unlike their settler forebearers, these boats were motorized and had fully stocked liquor shelves. Middle managers and IT grunts who couldn't afford front row seats to the spectacle of destruction got together wherever they could. They went to visit that friend of theirs' place who had a resemblance of a view. They shopped at the Bon Marché for something nice to wear to wash parties, Nordstrom's if they could swing it. While awaiting their publicly funded stadium's demise, petite bourgeoisie partygoers cued REM's "It's the End of the World as We Know It" on a burned CD. As the debris settled, they play Queen's Another One Bites the Dust, and the Verbs' Bittersweet Symphony because that was the witty thing to do. The city's introverts, the silent, awkward, overwhelming majority of its population to be sure, stayed at home and watched the King 5 broadcast of the Kingdome's collapse. Quote, "I think a lot of people don't understand the destruction of a perfectly functional building," said anchor Gene Ederson, end quote. There's reason to believe faces of color were few and far between at Kingdome implosion festivities. In Chinatown, the Asian Counseling and Referral Service held a gathering to dance on the Kingdome's grave. Some of the attendees were elders who had fought the stadium's placement in Chinatown. At the Kingdome groundbreaking ceremony back in November 1972, they had thrown mud balls at elected officials. Organizers leveraged their civil unrest into public resources for Asian Seattleites in the inner city. A nonprofit offering behavioral health programs and human services, ACRS had grown out of this protest. Quote, "I don't have many fond memories of the Kingdome," end quote, said Chinatown activist Bob Santos, "but we got out of it what we wanted." Seattle spectators didn't come together to watch the Kingdome's implosion so much as the Kingdome's implosion revealed the city's divisions. The last time Seattleites had gathered en masse was during the World Trade Organization protests in late 1999. 300 police officers in riot gear patrolled the Kingdome demolition site perimeter, looking for civil unrest to stifle, but with nothing to do, some cops in armored vehicles let kids straddle their tanks for family photos. In the days leading up to the main event, the city eradicated a homeless encampment near the Kingdome. The Seattle Times had said, quote, no wonder they feel at home here near a building condemned, broken down, and washed up," end quote. By imploding the Kingdome to build the football arena, voters had elected to fund, in 1997, Seattleites pissed away $668 million in civic debt for the new facility. At the time, 5,000 Seattleites had no roof to sleep under. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer reported that those incarcerated at the King County Correctional Facility had the best vantage point of the waste of resources. Quote, as the dome fell, prisoners cheered from their terrific view. The demolition registered a 2.3 on the Richter scale, gently shaking meal trays in the jail cafeteria. Seattle was supposed to be the city that transcended the old conflicts, a city above history, but at the turn of the century, it was sinking like everywhere else. 2 weeks after the Kingdom implosion, the NASDAQ index collapsed, erasing the fortunes of Seattle's nouveau riche. By cratering Seattle's economy, the dot-com recession completed the damage to the city's reputation that the WTO protests had started. Seattle was not exceptional. If capitalism coughed, it would catch a cold. Seeing Seattle's declining cachet and the increasing outspokenness of Ewing's at Boeing after WTO, Boeing announced in March 2001 that it would be relocating its corporate headquarters to Chicago. Quote, Seattle hasn't had a lot to cheer about lately, said the Seattle Times on March 27, 2000, after what would have been the Kingdom's birthday. A dream had imploded with the stadium. The Kingdom was a public facility conceived as part of the forward-thrust civic improvements in the heady 1960s. It embodied the hope that American city dwellers could come together to solve their problems and maybe even have fun while doing so. What the commentariat who ranked urban areas in major periodicals like Time and Newsweek wanted to see were cities with popular entertainments like pro sports. They wanted cities with lucrative industries and widespread prosperity, cities with the same arts and culture scenes that were being displaced in the stratified cities that they praised, cities that pacified urban conflicts between groups that had all the power and those that had none. One by one, the public literati that dissected and ranked urban areas realized that no city any longer satisfied the criteria for city of the future. Not Los Angeles or Cincinnati with their turn-of-the-century flare-ups over police brutality, not New York or Chicago with their blighted neighborhoods and high crime rates, and certainly not Seattle with its unsightly anti-capitalist protests, fleeing corporations, and growing population of people experiencing homelessness. Consequently, public sentiment in the 2000s turned not just against individual cities, but against urban America as a whole. The dream of the great US metropolis was dead, deader than the Kingdom. In the past, American cities were seen as having problems. By the year 2000, many believed they were the problem.
Hello, everybody. I'm Kurt Streeter. I'm a reporter at the New York Times. And although I work for the Gray Lady in New York, I'm a native of Seattle. Grew up in Seattle. Went to Roosevelt High School, South Shore Middle School out near Rainier Beach. And I have deep, deep ties to this city. And I left town for about 30 years or so, but I've come back fairly recently to work. And I'm just want to say I'm really pleased to be here. Your book is absolutely fantastic.
I appreciate you. Welcome home, and thank you so much for joining on this really rainy Sunday afternoon. It's great to be with you.
Classic Seattle day.
Absolutely.
How to begin here? I think one of the things that I wanted to just start with really was a discussion of why this book. How did this book begin? Why did you choose this topic? Because it's pretty unusual.
Yeah. So it's a pandemic book in a lot of ways, and a quarantine book in specific. The research for the early going chapters, the sort of foundation of the book was laid at a point in time where I think all of us were pretty starved for connection of various kinds, civic connection nonetheless. In the months of March, April, May, June of the year 2000, the sports calendar had come to a near complete stop. The games that we had gotten used to sort of marking the passage of time by, opening day, the NBA Finals, a lot of that was put on hold. And I think in a lot of ways you could say that there was a certain amount of, a certain amount of nostalgia that crept in for that civic connection, but also realizing that our politics in Seattle had seemed to have stagnated in much the same way that our day-to-day lives had stagnated as well. So I really wanted to try to take the opportunity to go back, look at our newspaper archives, figure out how it was that the city had responded to the earlier slowdown of the Spanish flu, as it was called, in 1918, And it was somewhere there in realizing that people were having all the same kinds of discussions at that point, 100 years ago, that we were having now, as far as when are the Seattle Metropolitans going to resume play with hockey? When would people be able to go back to UW football games? When would sort of the quality of life, the pace of life that people had gotten used to in the rapidly modernizing progressive era, a time where automobiles, movie theaters, lit streets were all invented, right? So a time where there was a dramatic rate of technological change that for a time had sort of stopped and paused, and people were very disoriented by that. I think in some ways as disoriented by technology pausing as they were by the emergence of all of this technology. So I think that was where I started to sort of piece together the kind of story that I wanted to tell. So I think to answer your question, why this book at this time, I think it was a response to feeling like there was a historicity of our own condition that I wanted to try to explore in our archives, in reading, a lot of our old newspapers, the rich volume of secondary source material about the city of Seattle that's been written. I wanted to try to see if I couldn't add to it.
And I love the word historicity. That's fantastic. One of the things that really strikes me about the book and that I love is that you go back deep into the history of the city. And this book really combines two of my great loves, sports. I was an athlete, and also a critique and deeper understanding of society. And for people to really understand this city now, we have to understand the city in its origins. What can you tell us about the Seattle of the 1800s, early 1900s, and its relationship with sports?
So, and it's such a cool question. I think the one of the themes that I discovered really early on that it seemed to me that I wanted to sort of extrapolate over and talk about and really spin out was sort of this idea that Seattle, as a Western frontier settler city, never really left behind its origins as a settler outpost in a lot of ways. Sure, there was the early frontier period, the early period of contact between white settlers and the indigenous people who were already here. And eventually, on top of the civilization that indigenous people had stewarded, Seattleites added public parks. They put on, great bike paths. There were great public stadia that were built. Dugdale Park in 1912, the Seattle Ice Arena some years later. But there was an underlying kind of wildness and an underlying cruelty in a lot of ways that underwrote both the city's, what it found entertaining, and also its social order. The fact that there were still a lot of Seattleites who, for example, had very virulent anti-socialist points of view because they felt that there was something about socialism as an ideology that did something to sort of temper the frontier wildness that businessmen and great bureaucrats were the ones who were supposed to be exhibiting. This idea that the true nature of the city was supposed to be a sort of dog-eat-dog city. So how dare you have people come in with social service agencies, people who are interested in building hospitals, people who are interested in building mass transit. These were ideas that were actually pretty tenacious going all the way into the present, arguably, but definitely into the years of the progressive era. And you see that in what the city found entertaining, right? I tell the story about a fight that takes place in a Seattle Metropolitans hockey game where somebody writes into the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, writes a letter of the editor that says, is actually complaining about the refereeing of the Stanley Cup championship between the Mets and the Montreal Canadiens, not because it was under-officiated, but because it was over-officiated. And the phrase that he uses is, well, if there's somebody who's a silly ass who wants to start a scrap, that's his prerogative. The referee should let them duke it out. Throughout the 20th century, we had intensely racialized boxing matches that I tell the story of, one of which in the 1950s, a fight between a local white amateur named Pete Rademacher and who thought he was Rocky before Rocky, challenges the heavyweight championship of the world. And there is essentially a white mob in the city of Seattle that is ready to really throw the heft of their weight behind this guy because they want to see the black champion, at that point in time, Floyd Patterson, taking down a peg. So I try to tell this recurring theme about this idea that Though Seattle styled itself as a city that was able to turn its back on its small town origins, on its frontier origins, a lot of the insecurity that came from that position never was really completely left behind. And one of the ways that the city was able to sort of prove its worth in the pop culture arena was through being a host of great games. To bring this aspect of the story all the way into the present, um, we're going to have getting ready to host, I believe it's the FIFA World Cup coming up, some of those matches in another few years, the Seattle All-Star Game. That was an impetus for the mayor's office in this city to go ahead and sweep out some homeless encampments. And so I think that there's constantly this tension between what Seattle feels like it has to do to get recognition and um, how that actually plays out and how we're treating especially some of our most vulnerable residents that I wanted to explore over the course of the book.
Shaun, that's really, you mentioned the insecurity of the city, and I've always been sort of struck by that, and that Seattle just never seemed, growing up and even kind of coming back in college, while I was in college, and I always felt that the city was never really comfortable with itself, could never just be fully comfortable with what it is and happy with itself. It always had to be a world-class city.
Right.
And that's actually one of the ways that, as I recall, the baseball stadium was, as they were trying to sell that to voters, to give millions in taxpayer money to build the baseball stadium, the argument was, in order to be a world-class city, we have to have
Right.
this stadium.
Mhm.
And same thing with the football stadium, right?
Absolutely. I think in some ways the default civic mood in Seattle is anxiety in a lot of ways because we're the city that's not, we're not Fresno or Rochester or, God forbid Albuquerque, but we're not going to be um, New York or Los Angeles or Chicago. So occupying kind of the I want to call it like sort of the middle child syndrome of urban America, where we're constantly sort of feeling like there's somebody that we have to be ahead of and somebody that we're constantly chasing as well. So I think that that's really the motivation behind a lot of the public resources that we pour into our sports because we feel like that's going to be the thing that's actually going to get us to that sort of next stage. And if it can't do that, then at least it will keep us from backsliding and being surpassed by a city that we believe we're better than, frankly.
It, we don't want to be Portland or Tacoma, too, right? I think another thing, Shaun, that you tease out a lot well, it's really a theme of this book is sort of the push pull between the idea of rugged individualism and the idea of, I guess, what I'd call kind of communitarianism, or and then the progressive movement. You were speaking about just now about public investment in sports. Well, part of that too is the City Beautiful movement, which was, and maybe you can explain that a bit. But I think one of the great things about Seattle is its park system. And I grew up, and I'm definitely a direct beneficiary of the park system here. Um, can you explain to us a little bit of sort of that history and the progressive movement and City Beautiful, and how these parks came together and some of the tensions there?
So as we're talking to one another in 2024, the feeling is that though Seattle is competitive for sort of West Coast dominance with a lot of cities like Portland, um, Boise somewhere up there, Tacoma, that there's a reason why Seattle for many years was known as sort of the queen city of the Pacific Northwest, right? It has to do with the amount of mega corporations that are located here, how much space the city is able to occupy in the arena of popular culture, general notoriety and fame. There was a period in time about a century and a half ago where that discussion was not settled, right? Newcastle, Olympia, Tacoma, to say nothing of Portland, San Francisco, there were all sort of cities that were sort of vying for what was going to be the next great trade hub and how were these cities going to find a way to differentiate themselves from one another, chiefly for the purposes of attracting East Coast capital and investment. Seattle, as it starts to, the first competition was to figure out how we're going to go about getting a railroad. Once that is secured in the 1890s or so, we're looking around and trying to figure out what the next step is going to be. And very early on, city bureaucrats realized that a big differentiating factor between Seattle, Portland, and Oakland, other West Coast cities, was whether or not you had a great park system. And so Seattle had sort of in the 1880s had a piecemeal park system that was funded mostly through the kindness of billionaires who donated land or donated money to acquire land, but residents of Seattle in 1902 actually elected to tax themselves for the express purpose of acquiring more parks land in the city. Later on in that decade, the city leaders partner with the Olmsted firm, which was responsible for great progressive era public works in the form of parks in many other cities. Uh, there was a public election that takes place in 1912 called the Bogue Plan for that was going to establish, in addition to almost 100 miles of subway transit, it was going to lead to the acquisition of thousands of acres of park space throughout the city, culminating in a great people's park that was going to be on Mercer Island, that was supposed to be Seattle's answer to Central Park in New York City. Well, needless to say, the Bogue Plan in 1912 was not ratified, but the ambition that I think it encapsulated spoke to this idea that in the progressive era, city dwellers could pull the levers of the public sector, they could use public funds, they could motivate public sentiment to create great institutions. I want to say probably something like 60 or 70% of the Bogue Plan eventually made its way out, piecemeal in how the city went about acquiring parks land. Jennifer Ott has actually written a great book about this topic that I draw on quite a lot in the research for this book. But I found this episode really fascinating because it was one of these instances where you look back and say, there's absolutely no way, given stagnation and the general lack of appetite, I think, among too many power holders in our city's history, past, present, and especially present and unfortunately maybe future, that something like that would be able to happen again. In other words, what do you think it would look like if you were to put a ballot measure in front of city voters right now to say what we need to do is expand access to parks, public investment in the construction of parks. We need to have more public spaces for people to be able to gather in and enjoy the dozen or so sunny days that we get in Seattle. And that would be a deeply contested fight. And you could see, for people who are familiar with the city and its politics, where and why all the opposition would come to that. So I wanted to really explore kind of this idea about, this was an episode in our history where we got together to do something really, really great and big. What is it going to take to actually muster the similar kinds of political will to move in a similar direction at a different and later point, knowing that the same opposition that we had to a fight like establishing great parks in 1912 is probably going to look really similar to what the opposition to that would look like in 2024.
Central Park, Mercer Island. So all of Mercer Island being said.
All of
that
Mercer
would be pretty
Island.
Cool.
Literally all of it. It would have been cool. It would have been cool.
Hopefully nobody here lives in Mercer Island, but let's move forward a little bit into more recent history. The team of my youth, the real great Seattle Sonics team, not the Seattle Sonics team of Sean Kemp and Gary Payton, but the Seattle Sonics of Gus Williams, Fred Brown, Jack Sikma, Lonnie Shelton, John Johnson, the team that won the NBA championship. And was coached by Lenny Wilkins, which was Lenny was part of this incredible run of history of black coaches for the Sonics in Seattle. Why is that team in particular important? And also if you can dive into a little bit of the kind of the history of the Sonics, we got to get them back, but. When they came to this city in the mid to late 1960s, how the Sonics were treated by the city.
So, I tried to write a book that unfolded in a lot of ways as a novel would unfold. And if you're a fan of fiction, you know that you have, especially epic historical fiction, right? It tends to be multiple overlapping stories that sometimes take up the duration of many generations. You have hopefully compelling settings, frequently a love interest of some kind. In this case, the interest is between the city and its people and its games and the attachment and the heartbreak and triumph that has resulted from that. But you also have to have really compelling characters too. And so in the process of formulating the book, I wanted to really try to find characters and motivations that I identified with. I don't know what this says about me, but most of my characters tend to be they tend to be driven by spite and like the idea that we're going to show them one day And so Lenny Wilkens is definitely somebody who fits into that category as somebody who is named player coach of the Seattle Supersonics in 1967, is sent hate mail by many residents of Seattle who are not quite ready to see a black person in a position of leadership. Lenny Wilkens' teams experiences some success in the middle 1970s until he's summarily released, at which point the Portland Trailblazers, who Wilkens had a seminal role in putting together, win the NBA title. So not only is Lenny Wilkens sort of expunged from a city that he had sort of developed really deep ties in and suffered with trying to bring a franchise into relevancy, but the other West Coast city that he had coached for has now won a title without him, but with the team that he put together. And so he simmered with revenge, and Lenny Wilkens is eventually brought back as director of Seattle Supersonics' player personnel. I believe it was in 1977, on the route to becoming the team's head coach one more time. And this was going to be Lenny Wilkens' chance to get back at not only the Portland Trailblazers, who were holding a title that he believed partially belonged to him, but also he was going to show a lot of the portion of white Seattleites who had rejected him about a decade earlier that he can coach, that he's a really good coach. They have a little bit of heartbreak in 1978, come up a game short to the Washington Bullets, and then come back and really piece together one of the great championship runs and one of the most underlooked championship runs, I think, too. I think actually prior to the Nuggets winning the title last year, the Sonics had been the only team since 1979 to win a championship that was not from West Coast team to win a championship that was not from California or Texas. So in this kind of regional competition, it was kind of Lenny Wilkens that had made the city stand out. His story, I think, parallels the Sonics' story generally, in the sense that they were not really accepted when they first came to Seattle. I tell the story in the book about how a lot of newspaper columnists, local newspaper columnists, were saying the arrival of an NBA team doesn't really qualify Seattle as a big league city. What you really need is baseball or football. Paul Silas, who had played with the Sonics for some time, had commented that it was an unfortunate sentiment because what it indicated was that there were many folks in the city of Seattle that were not ready to see economically empowered African Americans, and especially ones that didn't always pay the requisite deference to white spectatorship. And so the Sonics kind of pulled together all of these kind of the individual drive for recognition that Lenny Wilkens had, and I think mirrored in some ways the underdog mentality that the city as a whole has, even if the city was not able to quite recognize that they had gotten an incredible gift of an avatar in the Sonics and everything that they represented in the latter 1970s.
I mean, I think that that's a fascinating team and a fascinating time for me when I think about Seattle, because Seattle's always had deep racial issues that are swept under the rug in a city that likes to pat itself on the back as being very progressive and racially harmonious, when it's in fact extremely segregated, and there are a lot of problems. But in the 1970s, in particular, and when I was a kid, this was part of my experience. There was busing, and
Right.
and busing was a major thing in the city. And a lot of white folks, especially, were really pissed off about it. And then the Sonics come,
Right.
and the Sonics kind of bring people together in a way, right? And they show white Seattle a side of of black excellence that maybe it had subverted for a long time. You wrote sports after that championship. Sports in Seattle were a largely hollow spectacle of social harmony, and I thought that was really on point. I think most people who live in this city don't really understand or live in the city now, and we're not part of that deeper history. Don't really understand kind of what was going on in the '70s here. Can you get into that a little bit? And man, to me, especially busing.
The way that I try to frame the immediate post-civil rights era in Seattle, and what I was thinking about in trying to piece that particular chapter, which is the seventh inning of the book that covers the 1970s, it's a period where there's a sense that the civil rights movement had gone too far. Frankly, there were many white Seattleites who felt that way. The assassination of Dr. King in 1968, coupled with the onset of the Vietnam War, leads to mass protests, and those protests touch down in Seattle as they touch down in most urban areas. There is a massive protest where about 6,000 or 7,000 UW students in May of 1970 actually storm Interstate 5. There are other protests for racial justice. The Black Panthers are patrolling the streets in Seattle as they are in Oakland. And so what you see at that period, at around the same time that the Sonics are beginning their ascent, is the backlash to the push for racial justice. Articles written in the University of Washington Daily that suggest, one that was written by a Seattle area attorney that suggests that affirmative action programs are actually reverse racism. A young woman sues the university, a young white woman sues the University of Washington for reverse discrimination because she is rejected. Her mediocre application, frankly, for acceptance into UW is rejected. She believes that it is because of her racial background, never mind the fact that it is actually white women who are the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action statutes in the 1970s. Throughout urban America and in Seattle specific, I think you see a lot of backlash that maybe folks who are familiar with the city and its politics today could probably recognize the tenure of. And then here come the Sonics, who are eventually accepted, eventually able to earn sellout crowds at the Seattle Coliseum and then at the Kingdome, eventually become a signpost for a kind of model of Black empowerment. So we have kind of this contradiction. On the one hand, there's immense racial backlash throughout most of the 1970s, and on the other hand, the Sonics are literally the most popular ball game in town. I try to think about what the nature of that contradiction is. Like, how do you have something like that? The thing that I arrived on was the idea that when you had mass movements in the streets for police accountability, to say nothing of police abolition on the part of the Black Panthers, when you have Black students that are scaling the walls of the admin building at UW to demand greater minority enrollment into the college, when you had a Black freedom struggle that was in a lot of ways challenging the fundamental socioeconomic assumptions and pillars of a mid-century capitalist society as it existed at that point, that's pretty threatening. For a lot of people, it seemed threatening. But the Sonics could be kind of an antidote to that. They could be a symbol of what President Nixon had called in a series of television ads, icons of Black capitalism, right? They could be really, really well paid, and they could drive pretty nice cars. They could write articles in the Seattle Medium that were sponsored by Coors Beer, and you could sell lots of tickets, and people could go to buy, lots of beer and frequent a lot of establishments downtown while watching the games. And so if you're able to find a way to pivot, I think a challenging demand that was levied by a Black freedom struggle activist into sort of a general celebration of free market capitalism, then suddenly you actually have more of a grounds for the kind of racial harmony that many of us still participate in and celebrate to this day. So that's kind of the way that I kind of land on thinking about how it was that the Sonics, at a time that was so racially polarized, were able to become, through a lot of hard-won effort, a team that was celebrated in the city.
I gotta say, I think you really hit the nail on the head with that. Having lived through it and experienced as a 12, 13-year-old at the time, Black kid, growing up in this city, and the Sonic, Fred Brown, Gus, these guys were among my first heroes.
Right.
And they meant there's a tremendous amount to me. But Seattle was a very different. There's still racial issues here. Mm-hmm. But let me tell you, growing up in the '70s here, and I grew up. My family's somewhat unusual. I'm mixed. My parents married in 1954. My dad had been a basketball star at University of Oregon when there were only like 10 African Americans on the campus at U of O.
And he shut down Elgin Baylor.
He shut down. Well, yeah, we could tell that story a little bit later. But Seattle was also, so my folks met on campus at U of O, got married in Eugene, '54. then were looking for their next place to live. They didn't want to live in Eugene. Seattle was one of the few cities where mixed couples could live, and they still caught hell here. But there was always this sort of, there was a progressivism within the city and an acceptance within the white community on the one hand that allowed my family to grow, and myself and my four brothers, and my dad to get his business off the ground. But then there was, I mean, I grew up in the North End. I grew up by Green Lake. Man, the N word was ringing, ringing. I mean, I had to fight. I mean, I had to just be ready to fight, and it was the same, and it was the same for my black friends who were in the Central area too. But for me, like growing up in North Seattle, feeling very isolated, and where the real racist white kids were just super emboldened. It's yeah, I just love how you got into all that. Um, so fantastic job. And I don't want to spiel on too much about me. This is about you. Uh, let's talk a little bit about something that I love to write about in my work. Has been the role of female athletes, and which I see as really, like, to me, that's the story going forward, or in this present time. But Seattle has an interesting history with women athletes, and I did not know about Helene Madison. Right? Explain.
Yeah, so I really think of probably two or three. I think, especially as a historian, you really try to sit and achieve some kind of a critical distance from the people that you write about, especially if they were from a past generation, because um, you need a little bit of distance in order to piece together how their day to day lives sort of looked objectively. Otherwise, you're projecting, right? Like, um, it was there are two or three characters I want to say that it was incredibly difficult, historical figures that it was really, really difficult to maintain that distance from, because I felt like I identified with um, certain struggles that were placed in their way so intensely. We talked a little bit about Lenny Wilkens. Helene Madison was definitely one of those two or three. Um, Helene Madison, as the historian Maureen Smith had written, I think earns or deserves the distinction of being Seattle's first individual homegrown sports superstar. She was a swimmer that was born in June of 1913, had attended Lincoln High School in Wallingford, at one point in time owned every women's swimming record in existence, and that was the result of dominance that was displayed in the 1930 U.S. National Championships, and then again in the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles. She was somebody who, through her excellence in the sport, mobilized some of the donor networks that the now famous Boys in the Boat, the 1936 UW rowing team, literally rode to much greater prominence and much greater recognition. When the story is told in movies by George Clooney, and the great book that Dan Brown had written about Seattleites mobilizing together to, during the Great Depression, no less, to pool their resources to send the UW rowing team to the Hitler Olympics in 1936, where they triumph over Germany and Italy in the men's regatta. That donor network had actually been pioneered 4 years earlier by Helene Madison, who is, as far as I'm concerned, erased from not only the um, book that Dan Brown had written, but also the movie that had come out just last year. Uh, I think it's an unfortunate, the scrubbing of women athletes from the city's history is an unfortunate legacy of um, sexism in our city. Helene Madison uh, bore the brunt of that in her own lifetime. She comes back from the U.S. Olympics in 1932, one of the most celebrated women's athletes in the world, excuse me, one of the most celebrated athletes in the world, is unable to attain a job teaching swimming in the U.S. or in the Seattle park system, because the jobs are reserved exclusively for men. Uh, she lives a very, very difficult life from that point forward, that I detail in the book. But I do think that that legacy of a lack of recognition kind of lived on in subsequent generations in Seattle. The other end of the quote that you had mentioned about Seattle being a hollow spectacle of racial harmony was Those words, um, those words preceded a story that I tell in an article about a woman columnist in the Seattle Times who's writing at the time of the Sonics championship run, who says, "I'm just not really into this, and I'm not into this for two reasons. Number one, um, it just feels like if we had women's basketball, she could probably see herself a little bit more in the games that were being played. And number two, her husband, who she was on the brink of divorcing, stopped doing dishes when the Sonics games were on. Generally, did not do a lot of um, handle his childcare responsibilities that he had, and generally turned into kind of an oaf and a goofball when these games came on. And so there's a section of that story that I try to tack to the Sonics' triumphant run in '79 that I think resurfaces a little bit when we get to talking about the Seattle Storm in the mid 2000s. That and their saga takes up a good deal of the 10th chapter of the book, the extra innings chapter.
You also mentioned is it the black female baseball team? Is it
That's right.
the Owls?
Who graced the
I'd
cover
never.
of the book? Yeah. Um, the image of the Seattle Owls baseball team, they had won uh, two championships in the latter 1930s. One was a city championship, another was a state championship. Um, and as I was sort of, you're looking for materials that could, serve as illustrations, pictures you could use in the book. What struck me when I saw the photos of the Seattle Owls, the black women's baseball team, was how futuristic it looked. Like they're black women who are wearing hoop earrings, athletic sneakers, and athletic apparel. And that was a sort of a fashion statement that you saw a lot of people in the post-industrial era. So some, 50, 60 years later start to adopt. So I thought it was, I was pretty excited about the idea about having the Owls on the cover because it felt like you were sort of looking at both the past and the future by looking at this picture from a photograph from 1938. And I tell the story about the Owls in the fourth inning of the book as well.
And that's one of the things that I love about the book is I feel like I felt like I knew a lot about Seattle sports just going in, and then but there are all these little nuggets throughout the book. I'd never what the black female baseball team I had never heard or Helene.
Right.
Of course now we have the Storm.
Hmm.
We had Sue Bird. Unfortunately, she's no longer, and Brianna, but
Right.
they're going to have a great year this year. What do you see as the role of kind of that team in the Seattle scene now? And I mean, as speaking as somebody who's a national reporter, and I mean, the Storm are well known in New York. They're as well known as a WNBA team can be. And what do they mean to the city now, from your perspective?
Well, it's a way in which Seattle is kind of like we swing big, miss big when it comes to pop culture trends, and I think we're either way out of the margins, or as a result of being way out on the margins, we kind of are able to set certain trends that are not able to emerge in a lot of other places. You look at what um, the sort of basketball commentariat is obsessed with right now. A lot of it is women's basketball. There's kind of a sense right now that some of the most dynamic personalities in the sport of basketball are coming from the women's game. They're coming from, I should say, not the men's game. Um, that you have, players like Angel Reese, and you have players like Caitlin Clark. You have other sort of generations of stars that the only reason why we've gotten used to them is because we had earlier pioneers, if you will, who had sort of set the stage. And I think the Storm were a huge part of that, drafting Sue Bird, who was at one point in time the best, if not the best marketed women's basketball player in the country, coming out of UConn in 2001. Um, so I think it's another way in which sort of Seattle set a trend, and hopefully friends of yours in New York literary circles recognize the tremendous debt that they owe to Seattle for doing its part to popularizing women's sports in that fashion. And I know you hold them accountable on that.
I hope so.
Okay,
Yeah, yes, I will definitely.
great.
I've moved on from sports at the Times, but I wrote about this issue a lot in my Sports of the Times column, and I just I'm really enthralled with that. It's a movement, and it's going to be really exciting to see how it all unfolds. By the way, how much time do we have? Because I was wondering, do you want to do some Q&A?
Hi, just out of curiosity, so we're moving from California to Seattle, and this is fascinating. We just walked in and learning a lot about the city, and wanted to take your opinion on Seattle having a basketball team back, Supersonics. If you have any, opinion or from your research, shed some light if it's going to happen. Very fan of basketball, so one of the downside of moving here, losing Lakers, not having all the great teams, was kind of sad. But if you could just shed light on that, over.
And so when you say the Lakers are a great team, what do you mean by that? Exactly. Just want you to clarify the statement.
So, big fan of sport in general. I think it brings a lot of harmony, different cultures, different backgrounds that people come in and play sport. I think
Absolutely.
it's a fascinating combination of culture, at the same time also cohesion among multiracial hubs like Seattle and other
Right.
cities. So if you could just I see there's a lot of buzz on Supersonics and Las Vegas also opening
Hmm.
and or having an NBA team. If you could just, what's your
Absolutely.
sense, and what do you think it's going to bring to the city?
I think for a lot of years, Seattle was sort of able to in NBA circles, and this is not I'm not anywhere near the first person to see things this way or to articulate them this way, but I think that Seattle was sort of the um, example city that the NBA was sort of able to use to keep other NBA markets in line when they didn't want to shell out hundreds of millions of dollars for a public arena. They could always say, we literally took a team that was loved in nth level fashion from Seattle. They had won a championship there. They were a model for fan support. If we can relocate them, you know, New Orleans or Charlotte or Brooklyn, we can definitely relocate you. I think what you're starting to sort of see is that has been tapped out in a lot of ways. There has been a lot more public sentiment and public scrutiny against sort of this idea that we should be shelling out that much money nationwide in urban America. So ironically, what that means, I think, is that Seattle's actually better positioned now to get a team because the economics of how the NBA operates, and this is kind of my read on this part of it is the way that the NBA sort of operates is a basically a predatory business model has been tapped out. There are no more frontiers. You're not going to follow Elon and put a team on space. Like there's nowhere to go but to back to Seattle. So it's this kind of idea that Seattle was sort of able to re-enjoy its frontier position after its frontier position had been one of the reasons why the team was relocated in the first place. The team is too far. We need a team in Middle America. I mean, this is what was said at the time when the NBA relocated the Sonics and placed them in Oklahoma City. That was like a direct, straightforward ploy to appeal to voters in Middle America that I talked about, or to basketball fans in Middle America. I mean, David Stern, um, is having meetings with George Bush's campaign strategist in 2004 to talk about how to get the NBA more popular in some of the states that George Bush had just won. And so we got screwed, right? Seattle got jobbed. Now it's a very, very different climate, and the economics and the politics of it all suggest that Seattle is probably going to get a team that comes back. But and as much as I'm going to go to the games, I'm going to watch them all. I'm going to be the most chauvinistic Seattle Sonics fan that you've ever seen when we get this team back. There's also some part of me that kind of likes that we were the one city that gave the middle finger to the NBA and said, we're not going to do it. We don't care. You could do whatever you want to do. We have real needs for childcare. We're getting ready to, it's seeming like there's going to be a recession that we're going to face, real need for bolstering the social safety net. We just got done shelling out a huge, arena subsidy for both the Seahawks and the Mariners. And so there was a point where we told the NBA where they could put it, and I thought that was a pretty cool, if under appreciated episode in our political history. At the same time, it's going to be great to have the team back at a certain point. Yeah, and I guarantee we're winning a title before the Lakers win their next one. I promise you that. Promise you.
I grew up in Seattle too in the 70s, and Gus Williams was my hero totally, partly because he wasn't as tall as everybody else.
Yeah.
And I remember going to the Kingdome and seeing some of the playoffs there because they did some of the playoff games at the Dome. And when you were talking about the Dome, you mentioned forward thrust, that it's a product of forward thrust. And and I understand a lot of that was park construction too, from that legislation. I'm wondering how, I'm really looking forward to reading the book, but how you talk about forward thrust, the pros and cons of that kind of big civic effort.
I will never get tired of talking about the forward thrust bond initiatives. This was a series of ballot measures that were put to Seattle, King County voters in 1968 and then again in 1970, that were the result of civic leader Jim Ellis's grand vision for what it would take to make Seattle a more metropolitan city. Part of that plan was going to be, I think, 50 miles of subway transit. There was going to be a lot of park expansion, which passed as well. But also, Jim Ellis's idea was that, okay, we have this slate of 13 initiatives. You want to have some things on there that are really, really popular, so they enhance the overall chance that the meat and potatoes of the slate, which was the mass transit system, are able to pass. The transit system does not pass in 68 or 70, but in 68, Seattle voters do elect to construct the Kingdom with public funds. That is the facility that leads to the attraction of the teams that became the Mariners and then the Seahawks in the latter 1970s. And I tell the story at length about the forward thrust and the mixed legacy of it as a triumph on the one hand because it attracted the teams, as a heartbreak on the other hand because the mass transit system that was proposed would have been finished in 1980, and all of us probably would have ridden it to have gotten here by now because it was going to span the entire city. And I think it's kind of this, in addition to being sort of like one of the few like political visions that sort of it galvanizes the same kinds of passions in a lot of ways that sports do, and the fact that it comes up just a yard or two short, if you will, of the ultimate goal, is something that was really fun to sort of tease through. Like, why was it as a campaign not as successful as it could have been? I spend 7 or 8 pages talking about in the 6th inning of the book. But I think that it's another one of these sort of civic touchstones that shows what can happen when we move forward with great vision. And the idea that it was a citizen activist. I mean, Jim Ellis never had held an elected office in his life, but was still one of the most influential settler Seattleites to live. Says a lot about what can happen when people just get together and decide this is a problem and we need to have some sort of collective response to fix it. So I draw a lot of inspiration from Forward Thrust, even if it is, I think, part of the legacy of political heartbreak that you see in the city's history as well. Really appreciate that question.
So I grew up in San Diego, and I kind of just grew up with the Padres and the Chargers. Chargers being owned by the Spanos family during my time, and then the Padres. I believe it was Moore. I think it was John Moore. I can't remember the full name off the top of my head. So I grew up with two teams that were constantly trying to like win, and then they never do, and they fall short every single time. But what was really interesting to me was the amount of like rally and gung ho behind both teams, despite the fact that they would fall short every time. And I only moved to Seattle for college, so I've only been here for like 5, 6 years now. During your time, have you experienced that sort of same like gung ho and loyalty for like not just like the Seahawks or just the Mariners, but like sports teams in general? Do you kind of like resonate with that sort of saying gung ho? Have you experienced that or heard from people? Like I kind of see sort of at least like for example like the Mariners. Like I've seen a lot of that sort of like community of people coming together and be like whatever happens happens. It's kind of like
Right.
this is our team. These are our people sort of thing. And I don't know if that's an attitude that's like changed over the years or has it started that way. So I guess I'm just curious because, from San Diego, we only have those two teams and now one of them has left. We only have the Padres.
Right.
So,
Being a Mariner fan has sent people I love to very bad places psychologically. And I mean, I disowned the Mariners in 2018 because I decided enough was enough. I had been a fan since 1992. And it started to occur to me that there was actually a semblance of our politics and the way that people kind of keep rallying in order to get their hopes dashed. Um, that did, because it was so public and it was always such a spectacular. I mean, you go to the games, people ride mass transit to the games. Um, a lot of people that I know in political circles are kind of at these games. And because it's such a mass spectacle that is the receptacle of a lot of public funds and resources, and the team consistently underdelivers, it's hard not to think about the Mariners as kind of a microcosm for everything that's wrong with the American political process. That's the stage that I'm at kind of with that team. Like, I really hate this team. I mean, what they end up doing is it's so much um, public goodwill and resources that are wasted on austerity. I mean, you have the owner, the general manager coming out and saying, our goal is really to just try to win 54% of our games. Like, we just feel like if we can hit that goal, we're going to be fine. And it's like, do you not see how you're just getting killed by every other big market team? And you guys aren't hurting for money, but they've made the decision, the team's ownership, to really kind of hold on to a lot of that goodwill and the fiscal investment and not reinvest it into the team in the ways that the Storm have or the Seahawks have. So every time I talk to like real dyed in the wool Mariner fans, I feel like it's like I've never have been a part of a cult, but I could imagine what it would be like to have escaped one, and then you try to re-establish contact with somebody who's still on the inside of it. And like most cult leaders, Mariners general management is actually very savvy in letting people actually keep contact with people who have left, because they want you to see what the options are. But there are people who are just so unused to the idea that things can be better. And I think the only thing that's going to make the Mariners better as a team is massive civic disinvestment. No more, we're going to end whatever. I mean, there's like a litany of public subsidies that I think the Mariners are able to enjoy in all kinds of ways, and I think the cord needs to be cut. I cannot stand the Seattle Mariners.
I like the conversation about the Seattle Storm, and you mentioned Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese. Um, what is the pushback, or where do you think the pushback against Cheryl Swoops or some of the OG, Cheryl Miller? Why are people pushing back against them? Why has their legacy not been preserved like it should have been?
It's really unfortunate, and I think the question, as I understand it, is sort of looking at the sort of new wave of women's basketball players who the conversation around whom has been, I think, a lot more sophisticated and rich than it was in the middle 1990s around some of the women's basketball players that came a generation before them. I think that it's another example of. I actually do think that there has been progress in the way that women's sports has been marketed. Frankly, the way that it's been commodified, the cultural conversation around it is a lot more sophisticated than it was in the middle 1990s. I'm going to try to be very plain spoken about this part of it. I think there was a sense that the black women's basketball players in specific were, they were too butch. They were players that were not going to appeal to the male spectatorship, brutish as it was at that time. If you weren't going to wear the things that you expected women to wear, and they weren't going to talk as men at that point in time expected women to talk, they're going to have a hard time marketing them. And a lot of the careers of those players, the recognition of them suffered in a lot of ways. There was a really great a documentary about the women's Olympic basketball team in 1996 that was produced. I think it was 30 for 30 that was done by ESPN, where they talked about there was a little bit of resentment on the team because Rebecca Lobo, who was probably like there were probably like at least 5 players on the team that were better than Rebecca Lobo, but Rebecca Lobo was a player who was able to get a lot more of the recognition. Players on that team felt as if part of the reason why was because if it wasn't racialized, then it was definitely a fact that that Lobo had played into, had sort of just appeased male spectatorship in ways that the other women did not, and was able to benefit as a result. And so even though I think that was a very racialized story, I think that there's something that everybody can identify with that, where it just seems like we're all trying to kind of fit into these cogs and these pre-made templates, and if you don't fit sort of the mold exactly like perfectly, you're going to have a hard time getting the same opportunities as other people. I think that's a huge part of the way that the sport was marketed at that point in time, and I think it's really, really good to see that that's not as much the case anymore, and that there has been, as a result of LGBTQ plus fans being as vocal and as huge a part of the fan base as they've been, Generation Z and millennials, I think, doing a large part to correct a lot of that discussion. We're just ready for a lot more different kinds of options for what our public figures, sports figures, um, non-male figures in the public eye are able to offer and give. So the question is sort of around two stadium votes that took place in Seattle. One was in 1995 as the Mariners were going on probably the most meaningful moment that they had in franchise history, the run to the American League Championship Series that coincided with um, ownership's threat to move the team. And so if the Mariners did not win as many games as they did down the stretch, didn't make the ALCS, the Mariners probably would have been relocated to, I believe, to Tampa. Um, and once the vote actually goes in the other direction, people by a very, very slim margin, a county-wide vote, the vote is to decline funds to build the stadium that eventually becomes what we now know as T-Mobile Park. The state legislature is forced to convene some weeks later to authorize those funds because none of them wanted to take, frankly, the hit that state legislators later took for allowing the Sonics to leave. And so that, yeah, I covered that story in the ninth inning of the book, and then again, there was a vote for a Seahawks stadium in 1997. It was a little bit more palatable to voters because the stadium paid for itself. You can get into the weeds about sort of the tax funding mechanism, but the idea of it was that the Seahawks stadium paid for itself by a certain amount of the ticket revenue being recycled back into the funds for the stadium. Whereas the Mariners Stadium would have been a straightforward corporate giveaway, so that voters narrowly approved the 1997 stadium measure. And this is, you could write, the book could have been about this episode only. I mean, just looking at comparisons between how much we ended up spending on the Seahawks Stadium or the Mariners Stadium versus, needs for affordable housing, for example, or things of that nature could have been, I think, its own really its own book in a lot of ways, but I do try to bring that episode up just in the context of this is kind of like one of 15 or 20 examples of the city pouring a lot of resources into big games because of the recognition that we feel it's going to get us as a city, and in fact, might get us, but at what cost is the question.
It's funny, we haven't mentioned UW football, which is one of the pillars of sports in this town.
Yeah, and I talk about them so much in the book. I mean, I feel as much love for UW football as I feel contempt for the Mariners. It's like really kind of two sides of the same coin. Like one of those is what it looks like when you've cut all ties, and the other is what it looks like when you've just seen the face of love, which is what the UW Huskies represent. I mean, they are a publicly owned franchise. We got to get the players paid. That's another part of the equation, but they sort of represent what it looks like when you have a lot of public resources behind something that actually makes you feel good in exchange.
Was that love tested when they didn't win a game under Ty Willingham?
You suffer knowing that the highs are just around the corner, and when you have that much investment and that much fan support behind the team, you know that the eventual triumph is on the other side of it if you sort of stick with it. Not like a privately owned team that's not accountable to the people. Like UW football actually has to respond to alum and donor networks, and people are just going to be on their asses if the UW football team is not good in a way that I think we've just accepted that the Mariners will just never be because they're privately owned and not accountable. But yeah, there's a reason why the book is purple for sure.
I won't hold that against you, being a golden bear. I knew a little bit about Gil Dobie.
Yeah.
I think probably maybe a few people might here know who Gil Dobie is, but it was really fascinating to read about him. He's a seminal figure in the UW football history that I'd love to hear you expound on a little bit. And also, really, I mentioned Fred Brown and Gus Williams as childhood heroes of mine, but Warren Moon was like, I mean, I had the Warren Moon posters. I had I was there when he ran 70 yards against USC, and those two figures are really fascinating to me, and Gil Dobie for kind of what he represented at the time, Warren Moon for what he went through racially in this city, and to become what he became.
Yeah, absolutely. So Gil Dobie was the coach of the UW football team from. I actually want to take a step back. So one of the coolest parts about being able to research this book, I think, was just the idea that, like, I mean, 1908 was 116, 115 years ago at the time that this was being written, but feeling kind of the same kind of investment reading back on teams that they may have been around for like many years before I was born, and feeling the same sense of like pride around them. So like Gil Dobie, I almost feel emotionally as if I watched this man coach the team to win 50. I think they won 59 consecutive games from 1908 to 1915. Like literally did not lose against anybody. Several of these games they won by like dozens of points. I think there was a 72-0 game against Cal. My condolences that took place. That actually inspired the UW football fight song "Bow Down to Washington." But those were the significance of those teams was really they were like a Gilded Age throwback. They were playing in the progressive era where you had manicured parks and streetcars, and a sense that the city was sort of separating itself from its wild past. But there was still the generation after the frontier a lust for this kind of spectacle and this kind of really grimy entertainment. So people would congregate at a UW football a facility years before Husky Stadium that was called the Swamp. That was a terrible place. Like people would like cut their cut their faces open when they got tackled because there was like a bike path that was underneath some of the grass that they played on. I mean, they were winning some of these games like 2-0, 7-0, and Gil Dobie was just on the sidelines wearing animal skin sweaters, loving it because he didn't believe that throwing the ball was real football. Like real men got in the trenches and they ran the ball and they held the team to no points and they only scored because there was a safety. And I just feel like the same way that I think people threw themselves a lot behind the Seahawks in the 2010s when they played similar kinds of games. In fact, one of my actually fondest memories of this building was of watching, I think, the game against the first round of the playoffs. I think we played the Saints en route to beating the Niners, en route to beating the Broncos in the Super Bowl. But I think the Seattle Public Library had actually held a watch party for that game against the Saints, which I was at for. So it's just kind of it's just wild how, I mean, that's 100 years go by, and it's still the same kinds of attachments, whether you're watching the games here or you're watching them at the Swamp. Like, there's still kind of that attachment that grows. And I think the fact that UW football, again, is a public institution, deepens the feeling of belonging and pride there. Yeah.
Warren Moon?
Warren Moon, to me, I mean, we just watched one of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history, a black quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, win another Super Bowl, right? We're sort of now in the 21st century used to the idea that black players can be field generals, that they can be extensions of mostly white coaching staffs on the field, that they can exhibit a kind of calm under pressure that many did not believe that African Americans generally possessed, and certainly not those in athletic fields could have. That took generations and generations of players, doing well but coming up a little bit short, passing that knowledge on down. So Warren Moon, passing down a lot of the institutional knowledge that he has as a black quarterback to Russell Wilson, and this sort of fraternity, I think, of black quarterbacks that really, in a lot of ways, he began it at the University of Washington and began it under intense scrutiny. He confesses to Sports Illustrated in 1977 that he plays better on the road because he's jeered. Family and friends of his come to the games and they say that they hear racial slurs in the stands. Some people doubt the facticity of that statement. What is not up for question is the fact that the University of Washington daily entertains whether or not it's time to lynch Warren Moon after he struggles in a game in 1977. And he sticks it through. He ends up winning a Rose Bowl, guides the UW team to a national championship. And so there's kind of the overcoming part of it that I think is a part of the story of Seattle as a far west city that you can see sort of meted out in a lot of ways that the careers of individual athletes take place, especially ones that are coming from marginalized backgrounds. So that's why I focus so much on women athletes. I try to focus a lot on LGBTQ plus athletes, especially in chapter 4, Black athletes naturally. Because I think that when you have that broader, that A story of sort of the struggle for recognition, the thing that really substantiates that is when you have people that are coming from disprivileged backgrounds substantiating that through sport and politics that I try to spin out. Yeah.
I'm just wondering how, particularly the Latino influence, South Asian influence that's moving into the city. It's just a completely different place than it was 25 years ago.
Right. And I think that Seattleites of all ethnic and racial backgrounds can appreciate the idea of sort of what you laid out there with a super diverse crowd coming out to support a great spectacle, whether it's sports or really really good music. I think that all of us from all backgrounds in the city, I think in a lot of ways are feeling the loss in some ways of communities that have been displaced over the years, and you wonder why it is that people talk so much about wanting to see the Sonics come back, why there's been so much support for the Storm, and it's almost as if the what we have lost through our politics, we're kind of trying to make up for through our sport in some ways. And I think that as big and diverse as those crowds would be, if we were not a city that has endured waves and waves of gentrification, I think there's a good many of us who would say it doesn't have to be like that, right? And so that's a political question that we have to get really serious about as well. I mean, the fact that the generation, I think there was a story that was written in the Stranger, and this is probably in 2016, where they were talking about the era of mandated busing in the city of Seattle. And you look at, busing as an experiment lasts from 1978 through, I don't remember actually the terminal date, but it lasts, long enough for there to be many Seattleites who pass through public schools that 96.
Or around there.
So literally a generation,
98,
right?
97, right, as far as I recall.
Yeah, so you had like Lindy West and Sir Mix-a-Lot and Lynn Shelton and a lot of Seattle luminaries, people that really put the city on the map culturally. Well, they got a lot of their worldview and a lot of their ability to sort of deal, like the fact that Sir Mix-a-Lot kind of embodies like all the post-racial absurdities of what it means to be a rapper, like
Roosevelt High School.
Roosevelt High, right? That comes from a certain proximity that you get when you have people from different backgrounds going to school, learning, making a lot of the same mistakes with one another. So I think there's a tremendous cultural loss that we have felt without even knowing it from the lack of proximity. And you only get that proximity when people get together and they say, okay, great public schools, great public housing that working class people of all backgrounds can live in, great public parks so that all of us are going to be out on the 4th of July, seeing each other, enjoying each other's music, probably making fun of it a little bit too. Like that's part of what it means to live in a big cosmopolitan city. So you lose a lot of that when the city becomes more stratified. And right now, our games are some of the only ways that we have. I mean, we're not even talking about sort of the privatized version of what this looks like on the internet, where people are sort of feeling like they have proximity when actually you really don't. Like when there's actually a physical kind of embodied proximity, people from all different backgrounds, like it just makes us better and stronger and less able to be, I think, segmented in all the kinds of ways that some interests in our politics would hope us to be segmented. Yeah.